The first time anyone saw the house, it was already old. No one in the valley remembered its construction. No records bore its architect's name, and yet it stood. Timbers blackened not by fire, but by time itself. As if the wood had drunk centuries of sorrow, children whispered that the house breathed at night, its boards expanding and contracting like the ribs of some sleeping beast. And adults, though they scoffed in daylight, never dared to pass it after dusk. They called it the house where faces were born wrong, a name that clung to the place like mildew, thick and impossible to scrub away. Its windows, set too low and too narrow, resembled sockets rather than openings. The porch sagged like a mouth that had forgotten how to smile. And yet, the most unsettling feature was not in its construction, but in what grew around it. On the slope where the soil should have birthed wildflowers, instead came pale growths that resembled the beginnings of human features. Nubs like noses, clusters like teeth, ridges like brows. Farmers avoided the land, saying that every harvest from that soil carried a taste of flesh. Local folklore traced the curse back to a midwife named Hester Cray, who lived in the late 1700s. She was accused not of witchcraft, but of something darker, delivering children who bore not the faces of their fathers, nor the features of their mothers, but something wholly alien, infants with mouths that split too wide, eyes that floated off center, ears that bent backwards into spirals. The town, in shame and terror, drowned her in the creek that still runs black beside the house. But before she died, she cursed the soil. Every face you love will turn strange. Every child you hope for will return to me. For 100 years, the house stood vacant, its windows filling with spiderwebs and its floors collapsing into rot. Then, in 1883, a family moved in, the Adleys. No one remembers where they came from, only that they arrived with trunks heavier than furniture and eyes that refused to meet their neighbors. Within months, whispers began again, of crying that did not sound like any child, of curtains twitching when no one was inside, of neighbors' children waking with scratches across their cheeks in shapes resembling unfamiliar faces. When the first Adley child was born, the town's whispers became screams. The baby's face looked melted, as if two visages had been poured together into one fragile skull. The doctor who delivered it insisted that such deformities were not uncommon. But when the second child came, and the third, each more grotesque than the last, the town began to call it destiny. They remembered Hester Cray's curse, and they spoke of bloodlines twisted not by chance but by design. The Adleys never showed their children in public. When the rare funeral occurred, the caskets were sealed, nailed shut by trembling hands. Yet neighbors swore they could hear movement from within the boxes, even as they were lowered into the earth. The house where faces were born wrong was no longer a ruin. It was alive again, and the ground itself seemed to breathe heavier with each child that entered or exited its walls. By the turn of the 20th century, the Adleys had become a sealed mystery inside the valley. The family rarely left the house, save for quick trips to the market for flour and salt, always at dawn, always avoiding eye contact. Yet rumors swirled as freely as the wind that clawed through the hollers. The most enduring whisper was of the mirrors. Not a single pane of reflective glass remained intact within the Adley home. Peddlers who brought mirrors claimed the Adleys would not allow them past the threshold. Shards of shattered silver lay scattered in the yard, glittering like broken stars in the dirt. Those who trespassed, usually boys testing their courage, spoke of faces peering from the windows, but never the same face twice. Sometimes a child's, sometimes a man's, sometimes something unfinished, half-grown, still forming like wax in the heat. The boys said the faces followed them even after they fled, turning up in puddles, in polished spoons, even in their dreams. Several of those boys grew into men who later hanged themselves, their notes rambling about the wrong face, trying to take theirs away. The Adley lineage thickened, though no one could say how many lived within the house. Birth records vanished, either never kept or burned by some unseen hand. The town clerk once remarked that the Adleys gave him chills, as though they were a family with no beginning and no end, a circle that tightened with each generation. He died in his sleep the same week, his face contorted, jaw twisted in a way no natural rigor mortis could explain. By 1912, the house itself had changed. Witnesses swore that its walls were shifting. A doorway that once faced west now opened south. Windows appeared where none had been, then disappeared overnight. A schoolteacher who mapped the valley drew 3 sketches of the house in 1 year, and each sketch depicted a different structure. Yet the Adleys swore nothing had changed. They insisted their home had always looked the same. Then came the child the valley would never forget. In spring of 1914, a woman named Clara Adley gave birth after 40 hours of unbroken labor. The midwife who attended never spoke of it again. Her hair turned white within weeks, and she left the valley without farewell. But those who heard the cries knew something was wrong. It was not the cry of an infant, it was the voice of many. Layered, overlapping, rising and falling in unnatural harmonies, like a choir trapped inside a single throat. The child never saw sunlight. For 7 years it was kept inside, its presence betrayed only by the glow from a single attic window. That glow flickered like a candle, but neighbors insisted it pulsed in rhythm, as if it were breathing. A traveling photographer once set up his lens on the hill to capture the strange light. He took only 1 image before he fell violently ill. Weeks later, when he developed the plate, he burned it instantly. In its place had not been a house, nor a window, but dozens of faces pressed against the glass, all wrong, all watching. After that, the valley no longer spoke of the Adleys with suspicion. They spoke with fear. And the name of the house was spoken only in whispers, as though saying it aloud gave it strength. The valley kept its distance, but the house did not. By the 1920s, strange happenings began to bleed beyond its walls, seeping into the lives of those who had never set foot near the Adleys' land. Children in neighboring farms woke screaming, clawing at their own cheeks, insisting someone else's face was trying to grow over theirs. Old men swore they saw loved ones standing at the edge of their fields. Wives long buried, sons lost to war. Yet when they drew closer, the faces slipped, reshaped, and revealed eyes that were not human at all. The sheriff at the time, a wary man named Hal Stenson, claimed he would bring law to the Adley place. He entered the house with 3 deputies one November morning. None carried weapons, though each clutched a Bible. Hours passed. The sun fell. Only one deputy returned, his hair matted with blood not his own. He would not speak of what he saw. When pressed, he muttered only, "They wear us. They wear us to learn how to be." He never left his bed again, wasting away until his face grew thin and tight, as though something beneath was pulling it taut to fit itself inside. The townsfolk began to notice something else. The Adley children aged strangely. Some seemed to remain infants for years, while others appeared to skip entire stages of life. One day a boy, the next a grown man with a crooked, uncanny smile. Faces blurred from memory. A shopkeeper swore the same Adley girl bought sugar from him for 20 years without ever seeming to change, her freckles frozen in place. Another merchant argued that he saw her once, just once, as an old crone leaning heavy on a cane, and that when he blinked she was a child again, tugging at her braids. And then there were the masks. At the autumn fair of 1927, 3 Adleys came into town, covered in cloth hoods stitched crudely with twine. They danced in the square while fiddles played, spinning, stomping, their heads swaying side to side. The laughter of onlookers turned to silence when the smallest of the dancers slipped. His hood fell back, and the crowd saw a face that was not a child's, nor a man's, but many faces overlapping, sliding like oil on water. Eyes blinked out of time, mouths opened and closed soundlessly. The fiddler dropped his bowed. The crowd scattered. By the next dawn, the town council declared the Adleys unwelcome. No more would they buy, sell, or trade with them. But isolation did not starve the house. It seemed only to deepen its hunger. The soil around the property darkened to near black, and travelers swore the trees themselves leaned away from it, their branches twisting like hands warding off a plague. Animals would not graze there, though bones often littered the ground, as if the earth itself had chewed and spat out its meals. And through it all, the house stood unchanged, yet not unchanged. Each time someone dared glimpse it from afar, they saw new windows had opened, new shutters grown, a house still being born, still shaping itself around the lives within. And deep inside, the Adleys continued their breeding, their rituals, their pursuit of faces not meant for this world. By the early 1930s, the valley had learned a bitter silence. Families no longer spoke of the Adleys except in whispers too low for children to overhear. Yet silence did not protect them. The wrongness of the house reached out like roots, tangling into lives that wished only to forget it. Cattle were born with cleft faces, their skulls splitting down the center, as though trying to grow two heads. Chickens hatched with eyes on the backs of their necks. Dogs howled for hours at reflections in still water, refusing to drink. Farmers buried these mistakes in shallow graves, hoping to hide them, but more appeared with every season. The valley folk began to mutter that the land itself was catching the Adley curse, as if the soil were trying to mimic what grew inside the house. Stories spread of the Adleys' rituals. On moonless nights, flickers of fire could be seen through the warped glass of their attic windows. Neighbors swore they heard chanting, not in English, nor in any known tongue, but in a slow, guttural language that seemed to grind through bone. Sometimes, in the pauses between the chanting, came weeping, but it was not the weeping of grief. It was the sound of flesh stretching, tearing, being molded into new shapes. A drifter passing through the valley told of seeing them, gathered in the field at midnight. He claimed the families stood in a circle, each wearing a mask carved from wood so thin it bent, with their breathing. At the center of the circle lay a shallow pit filled with water that gleamed black under the stars. Each Adley leaned forward, pressing their mask into the pool, then lifting it again, the wood now damp and pulsing, as though alive. The drifter did not stay to see the end. By morning he had left the valley, refusing to ever return. The children of the house were rarely glimpsed by outsiders, yet evidence of their presence spread. Carved faces appeared in the bark of trees, not etched by knife, but grown from the grain itself. Fence posts warped into mouths, hollowed and gaping. One farmer awoke to find every pane of his windows bearing the impression of a face, pressed from the inside though the house was locked and empty. The impressions faded by noon, but not before he cut the glass free and buried it in the churchyard. By 1936, those brave enough to study the Adley genealogy saw the truth that the valley had long suspected but dared not name. There were no outsiders in their bloodline, no marriages to neighboring families, no new names in their records. The tree was not a tree at all, but a circle, its branches forever folding back upon themselves. The Adleys did not marry for love, nor for survival. They married for the face, to preserve it, to alter it, to refine it. Whatever vision they pursued, it demanded generation after generation of sacrifice. And still, children were born within the house. Children who did not laugh, who did not cry, but who stared silently from shattered windows with expressions no one could decipher. Faces that belonged nowhere. The valley began to believe that the Adleys were no longer human. They were something else, using human flesh only as raw material. By the 1940s, the war had carried many of the valley's sons overseas, yet even those oceans away wrote home of dreams that began the same way, a house standing crooked, its windows filled with faces that watched but never blinked. Soldiers in Italy, in France, in the Pacific jungles confessed in letters that they awoke clawing at their own skin, terrified that their faces were not their own, Mothers burned the letters rather than read them aloud, for each ended the same. Tell me if my face has changed. Back home, the Adley property grew more untouchable. Travelers who strayed near spoke of hearing voices echoing through the hills, not carried by air, but seeping up from the soil. A boy hunting rabbits swore he saw a face pressed into the mud, lips moving though no sound escaped. When he returned days later to show his father, there were dozens of such impressions in the dirt, all facing toward the house. Inside those walls, the family's obsession with faces had grown ritualistic. Survivors, maids, farmhands, tradesmen who worked briefly for the Adleys before fleeing, whispered of masks crafted not from wood, but from skin. Stitched carefully, dried and stretched like parchment, hung in rows along the upstairs hall. Each mask bore expressions frozen mid-scream, mid-laughter, mid-weeping, and the family wore them during their nocturnal gatherings. One servant swore that the masks fit too perfectly, as if made for those who wore them, even when the features did not match. The children of that era were stranger still. A schoolteacher in town claimed 2 Adley boys enrolled in her class. She remembered their stillness, the way they never raised their hands, never blinked, never seemed to breathe. They drew endlessly in their notebooks. Faces, hundreds of them, some familiar, some impossibly distorted. When the teacher confiscated one sketch, she recognized her own likeness, except the mouth was sewn shut and the eyes had been moved to the cheeks. She locked the page in her desk. By morning it was gone. The boys never returned to school, and their names were erased from the register as if they had never been. In 1947, a fire swept through the northern woods, threatening to consume the Adley house. The town gathered on the ridge to watch, hoping perhaps the curse would burn with it. Yet as the flames neared the property, the wind shifted. The fire curled around the boundary like a stream flowing past a stone. Not a single ember touched the house. The Adleys stood on their porch, silent, faces hidden, watching the townsfolk watching them. One man swore their shadows stretched longer than the firelight could account for, writhing across the ground like reaching arms. That night, a sickness spread through the valley. Dozens fell fevered, their skin blistering not with heat, but with raised welts in the shapes of features. Lips along the shoulder, an eye on the thigh, a tooth budding from the palm. Most faded within days, but a few lingered. A woman bore a second smile beneath her chin until the day she died. A child's left ear never stopped whispering words in a language his parents could not understand. The valley realized then the Adleys did not need to leave their home. The home itself was spreading. By the 1950s, the town had settled into a rhythm of fear. People no longer spoke openly of the Adleys, yet their silence was louder than any confession. Churches filled with whispered prayers, doors were bolted earlier each night, and still the wrongness seeped in. Travelers began to vanish. Salesmen, drifters, even a census taker, each last seen near the Adley property. The sheriff's men searched the woods, but all they ever found were scraps, a suitcase torn open, papers scattered and scrawled with faces, a shoe with teeth marks too human to belong to an animal, a camera, its roll of film developed into nothing but blurred images of eyes. No bodies were ever recovered. People said the house did not kill, at least not in the way men understood killing. It consumed. Inside, the Adley generations folded tighter upon themselves. Cousins married cousins, brothers to sisters, fathers to daughters, until lineage became a circle without entry or exit. Their children bore the evidence, mouths on foreheads, eyes ringed around the scalp like crowns, noses grown sideways into jagged ridges. Yet none were hidden in shame. The Adleys treated each deformity as sacred, proof that their line was nearing its intended shape. Outsiders called them cursed. The Adleys called it completion. Stranger still was the voice. Reports surfaced of a single sound carried from the house during nights when the moon hung thin. Witnesses described it as a hum, low and steady, vibrating through the ground, rattling panes of glass miles away. but others swore it was more than sound. They said it was language, a wordless command that threaded into dreams. People who lived closest to the Adleys' land confessed they woke in the night standing before their mirrors, tracing their own features with knives, scissors, razors. Most stopped before damage was done. Some did not, and still the house itself shifted. A postman who braved the lane once a month swore that each visit, the front door stood in a new place. Once it was set low into the ground, like the entrance to a cellar. Another time it appeared 3 stories high, with no staircase to reach it. Yet each time, the Adleys emerged to take their parcels, faces half hidden, movements smooth and synchronized, as though they were not individuals but parts of a single body. A handful of men planned to end it. In 1958, armed with kerosene and rifles, they marched to the property. They swore they would burn the house, rid the valley of its blight. They were never seen again. Days later, their families found objects left on their porches, a set of false teeth arranged in a smile, a boot with skin still inside, a bundle of photographs showing the missing men, but with faces blurred, melted, or entirely replaced. From that year forward, no one tried again. The house had grown too strong, and the valley had learned a terrible truth. The Adleys could not be destroyed without destroying something deeper, something tied to the land itself. And still, the children kept coming. Born wrong, yet cherished. The 1960s brought change to the world, but in the valley, time stood still. The Adleys' house remained as it always had, yet never the same. By now, no one dared walk the lane, not even in daylight. The silence there was different from any other silence. Birds stopped singing. Insects did not hum. Even the wind refused to move. To stand within sight of the house was to feel watched by every window, every warped plank of wood, every shadow within. Those who risked a glimpse saw the Adleys were no longer fully human. Their movements were too fluid, like marionettes on invisible strings. Faces shifted as they spoke, expressions melting and reforming, mouths appearing where none had been before. A merchant delivering goods from afar returned pale and shaking, insisting that the woman who met him at the porch had worn his mother's face. Though his mother had been dead for 10 years, but the house no longer confined itself to the valley. Strangers in nearby towns began to vanish. A girl walking home from school in the next county was found weeks later, wandering a field barefoot. She did not know her name, could not speak a word, but her face bore traces of 3 other people. Cheekbones misaligned, a jaw too wide, eyes that didn't match in color or shape. Doctors called it trauma. The valley called it the Adleys' reach. By 1966, the family's rituals had grown bolder. On nights of eclipse, people claimed to see bonfires burning in the yard, and figures circling them, their shadows long and disjointed. Reports spread of chanting that carried for miles, not merely heard but felt, rattling the teeth in one's skull. Those who listened too long developed fevers, their skin swelling in strange, face-like protrusions that faded only after weeks of bed rest. The children of the Adleys, now countless, were said to move in packs. Witnesses spoke of them walking the tree line at dusk, dozens at once, their heads cocked at the same angle, their lips twitching in half-formed smiles. None spoke. None blinked. They only watched. A hunter once fired a warning shot when he encountered them. The next morning, he was found hanging in his barn, not by a rope, but by strips of skin carefully peeled from his own face. More terrifying still was the rumor that the Adleys had begun to perfect their craft. Not all their faces were wrong anymore. Some were flawless, too flawless. There were whispers that travelers who disappeared had not been killed, but remade, their features reshaped, their voices stolen. A boy who enlisted and returned from war seemed unchanged, until his family realized he no longer remembered their names, and in moments of silence, his smile lingered too long, as though it had been glued there. By decade's end, the valley no longer believed the Adleys were breeding merely for survival or ritual. They were building something, an army, a congregation, a collection of faces that could walk unnoticed among the rest of the world. The house had become more than a home. It was a factory, a mouth that would never stop consuming. The 1970s marked the beginning of the house's true haunting. By then, few dared to speak the Adley name, yet their influence bled through the valley like poison in water. It was no longer just whispers of deformity, no longer sightings of strange figures at dusk. The house itself began to rewrite the world around it. At first it was the mirrors. Homes nearest to the Adley land reported that glass no longer held their reflections. Instead, faces of strangers appeared, hovering just behind the surface, pressing forward as though begging to be let through. Some smiled, some wept, some twisted in silent screams. One family boarded over every mirror in their house, but their windows soon began to ripple with the same ghostly faces until they abandoned the valley altogether. Then came the voices. People would wake in the night to hear their own names whispered from the corners of their rooms. Sometimes it was a child's voice, sometimes a parent's, sometimes their own voice echoing back at them. The whispers grew louder over weeks, until entire households fled, leaving tables set for supper, beds still warm. They would not even stop to gather their belongings. The valley shrank house by house, road by road, until only the most stubborn remained. And those who remained began to change. Their features grew soft, blurred, as if sculpted from wax left too close to the fire. Photographs taken in town meetings from that decade show faces indistinct, smudged at the edges, as though the camera itself could not decide which face belonged to which man. People joked nervously that the valley folk were beginning to look alike, but none laughed long. Meanwhile, the Adleys thrived. No one knew how many of them lived in the house by then. Dozens, perhaps hundreds. Each generation folded into the next, their features becoming stranger, sharper, smoother. Outsiders who strayed too close described glimpses through the windows, rows of faces hanging like lanterns from the rafters, eyes glowing faintly in the dark, children crawling along the ceilings with mouths sewn shut, women standing motionless before mirrors, peeling away their skin like garments, only to pull new ones from hooks along the wall. In 1977, a group of college students from the city came to document the legend. They entered with tape recorders and cameras, determined to prove the house was nothing more than myth. None returned. Weeks later, a package arrived at the university. Inside were reels of tape, each filled with hours of whispering. Not words, just breath, rising and falling, 1,000 voices layered together. At the end of the final tape, one voice emerged clearly, speaking in perfect comms. "This face is yours now." By decade's end, the valley had become a ghost town. Homes stood abandoned, crops left to rot, livestock gone feral. Yet through it all, the Adley house stood strong, its walls pulsing faintly as though alive, its windows multiplying, its roofline crawling higher each year. Those who dared to drive past at night swore they saw faces peering from every pane. Not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands, each one unique, each one waiting. The house was no longer just a home for the Adleys. It had become a cathedral, a place of worship to something older, hungrier, and infinitely patient. By the 1980s, the Adley house was less a building and more a presence. The valley lay abandoned, swallowed by weeds and silence, yet the house stood unbroken. Its paint never peeled, its timbers never sagged. It did not age the way other houses aged. It pulsed. It breathed. Travelers who dared the road swore they saw the boards of its porch shift in rhythm, as though the house itself had a heartbeat. The Adleys themselves were rarely glimpsed, yet their influence spread further than ever. Cities miles away reported disappearances. Commuters who never reached home, children who wandered from playgrounds, women last seen stepping into mirrors that did not return their reflections. Each missing person's photograph carried whispers, the curve of a cheek too familiar, the smile too wide, the eyes belonging to someone else entirely. It was as if the house were collecting not only from its valley, but from everywhere. Inside, witnesses spoke of endless corridors, not built by carpenters, but grown. Walls bulging outward, hallways stretching longer each night. Rooms filled with mirrors that did not reflect, but recorded. And behind each mirror, faces pressed close, mouths moving soundlessly, waiting for release. One survivor, found wandering half mad on the interstate, claimed he had been shown his own reflection. Except the reflection was already wearing his face, while he stood faceless before it. He never spoke again. By 1985, the Adleys had ceased to be a family. They were something larger, something singular. No longer individuals with names, but fragments of a greater mask. People swore that when they moved together, their feet struck the ground in perfect unison, as though one mind guided them all. And when they spoke, rarely, but terribly, their voices layered into a chorus that rattled bone, a sound like every face on earth speaking at once. The house itself grew monstrous. Rooflines split and twisted skyward like antlers. Windows bred across its walls like spores. At night, beams of faint light shone from within, as though 1,000 faces glowed like lanterns in its halls. Those who saw it from the ridges swore that the house was no longer confined to its plot of land. It stretched outward impossibly, its shadow falling across the valley like a great black veil. And then the disappearances became epidemics. Whole buses lost, families vanished from locked cars, only their clothes left folded neatly on the seats. Entire blocks of apartment buildings emptied in a single night, curtains swaying in open windows, dinners cooling on stoves. Police wrote reports. Governments offered no explanations. But the old valley folk, the ones who had fled decades earlier, knew. They whispered it with cracked voices, too afraid to say it loud. The house is no longer waiting for you to come to it. It is coming to you. By decade's end, the house where faces were born wrong was no longer a legend, nor a curse, nor even a place. It had become a hunger without borders, a cathedral without walls, a face that stretched across the world, waiting for yours to be added to its collection. And still, somewhere in the heart of it, the Adleys sang,